Welcome to a deep dive into a perspective you might not expect. We're digging into the Sun News Online article, Racism. Africa is not innocent. And, right off the bat, it sounds kind of controversial, right?
Yeah, definitely eye-catching. Well, let me be clear. This isn't about pointing fingers or anything like that. It's about understanding a viewpoint that often gets overlooked, I think, in discussions about racism.
It's a challenging argument for sure, this idea that to really tackle racism globally, we need to examine those places, like Africa, where we might assume racism isn't the primary issue.
Right, and it's very easy to focus on injustice that's happening elsewhere. But this article really wants us to kind of flip the script a bit, and they use a tragic event I think we all remember, the death of George Floyd, as a starting point.
Exactly. The author takes the global outcry over George Floyd's murder and kind of uses it as a springboard to dive into this deeply rooted issue of tribalism in Africa. And what's fascinating is how they connect these seemingly, disparate events.
Okay, so let's talk about tribalism, because it's not a word you hear every day.
Right.
What exactly does it mean in this context? I feel like there's more to it than simply belonging to a certain group.
Yeah, you're right. It's much deeper than that. We're talking about ingrained prejudice, discrimination, even violence between different tribes within the same country or region. But I think it's important to understand that it's not just about cultural differences. Tribalism often intertwines with power dynamics, access to resources, and these historical grievances that have been allowed to fester over time.
So when this article argues that tribalism within Africa might be a bigger problem than racism itself, that's a pretty bold statement, I think, about the impact of these, like you said, deeply woven societal issues.
It is bold. And what the author's arguing is that tribalism is arguably even more harmful than racism because it's prejudice directed inward towards your own people. If you think about it, racism is often about, a dominant group oppressing others. But tribalism is something that fragments society from within.
Yeah.
It creates this cycle of distrust and conflict that can be incredibly difficult to break.
And this isn't just a modern day issue, right? The article really digs into the historical context of tribalism in Africa.
Absolutely. One point that really struck me was how the article highlights that tribalism in Africa predates even the transatlantic slave trade.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people, myself included, tend to think of that horrific period as, kind of the origin of many of Africa's problems.
Yeah, I was definitely guilty of thinking that way. So you're telling me that the enslavement of one tribe by another was happening long before European involvement?
Yes, and that historical context is crucial. It challenges some common narratives about Africa and forces us to confront a more, complex reality. And the sad truth is that these internal conflicts made many African societies vulnerable, first to the slave trade and then to colonialism.
That's a heartbreaking realization. Did these pre-existing divisions play a role in how some European powers were able to establish a foothold in Africa?
Unfortunately, yes. The article even talks about how some tribes, fueled by their own rivalries and often manipulated by European powers, participated in the slave trade. It's a difficult truth, but understanding this history, I think, helps us grasp the deeply rooted nature of tribalism and its long-lasting impact on the continent.
It really makes you think about how historical events, even those centuries old, can still have repercussions today. But this tribalism didn't just vanish when colonialism ended, did it?
Sadly, no, you're right. The article argues that tribalism has cast a long shadow over post-colonial Africa, hindering progress and fueling some of the continent's most devastating conflicts.
And we can't talk about this without mentioning the horrific example of the Rwandan genocide.
Absolutely. The article brings up the Rwandan genocide, where the Hutu majority turned on the Tutsi minority with unimaginable brutality.
Right.
And it's a chilling example of what can happen when tribal tensions are exploited and allowed to escalate. I mean, it's a stark reminder that these divisions aren't just about, cultural differences. They can be weaponized to devastating effect.
Yeah, and it's easy to think of these as isolated historical events. But the article also highlights the ongoing conflict in South Sudan between the Dinka and Nuer tribes as well.
Right. The conflict in South Sudan, with its roots in tribal tensions and this competition for resources, it shows us that the legacy of tribalism is still being written today. It's a stark illustration of how these divisions can fracture nations and perpetuate cycles of violence and suffering.
So we're talking about very real, very human consequences here. And it feels like the article is pushing for a deeper conversation here, especially when you compare the situation in Africa to what's happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah, you're picking up on something really important. The article seems to be urging a kind of global self-reflection, particularly for those who are quick to condemn racism elsewhere. It's like it's asking, Can we really address injustice in other parts of the world if we don't also confront the prejudice within our own societies?
It's a powerful question, and the article uses some compelling examples to drive this point home. They talk about Barack Obama's presidency, for instance.
Right. It's fascinating how they point out that Obama, a black man, achieved the highest office in the United States, a nation grappling with its own complex history of racism, right? And yet they argue that due to these deeply ingrained tribal dynamics, someone of Obama's Luo ethnicity might have faced insurmountable obstacles to achieving that same level of political power in his ancestral homeland of Kenya, at least at that time.
That's a stark comparison. It really highlights how the barriers erected by tribalism can sometimes be even more impenetrable than those built by racism, even in a place like the United States, where race relations have been so fraught. But Obama isn't the only example, right? The article also talks about Ilhan Omar.
Yes. Ilhan Omar's story is another powerful illustration, I think.
Mhm.
Here we have a Somali-American congresswoman who has achieved remarkable success in American politics. But the article asks us to consider the situation in Somalia, a country still plagued by tribal conflicts, many stemming from these historical tensions that forced Omar's family to flee. Would she have had the same opportunities in her birthplace? It's a question that really makes you think about the ripple effects of tribalism, both for individuals and for entire nations.
So we have these high-profile examples, but the article also brings it down to a more personal level, I think, with the story of Sisu Uha, who wrestling fans might know better as Apollo Crews. What's his story, and how does it fit into all of this?
So Uha's story is really compelling. He's a successful Nigerian-American professional wrestler, born in the U.S. to Nigerian parents of the Tev tribe. And the article uses him as an example of how tribalism can limit potential. They suggest that if Uha had been born and raised in Nigeria, particularly in Taraba State, where there's a history of conflict between the Tiv and Jukun tribes, his life might have been drastically different.
You're saying he might have faced discrimination or limited opportunities just because of his tribal background?
Exactly. The article even goes so far as to suggest that he might have been caught in the crossfire of the ongoing tribal conflict in the region. It's a sobering thought, but it really underscores the very real human cost of tribalism. This isn't just an abstract concept. It has tangible and often tragic consequences for real people.
It makes you wonder about all the potential that's been stifled, all the dreams that have been deferred because of this kind of ingrained prejudice. But where do we go from here? If we accept the argument that tribalism is a significant hurdle for Africa, what does that mean for the larger conversation about racism and inequality globally?
That's the crucial question.
Yeah.
And I think the article's concluding message is quite powerful in that regard. It suggests that for Africa to truly be a force for change in the fight against racism on a global scale, it needs to confront and address its own internal struggle with tribalism.
So it's not about diminishing the very real struggle against racism, but about recognizing that the fight for equality has many fronts.
That's precisely it. And sometimes the most challenging battles are the ones we fight within ourselves and within our own communities. It's about acknowledging those uncomfortable truths and being willing to do the work to dismantle these harmful systems of prejudice wherever we find them.
It's like looking in the mirror before you point a finger, right? It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know if you've ever heard that saying, you can't sweep someone else's porch when your own is a mess.
Right.
And it feels like this article is urging that kind of introspection, but like on a global scale. Absolutely. It's a call for honesty and a willingness to confront those uncomfortable truths, within our own societies. Because how can we as a global community effectively fight against racism and prejudice everywhere if we're not also addressing those same issues within our own communities and even within ourselves, right?
Yeah, it's a powerful message, and I think it really challenges the way we typically talk about these issues. It's not about diminishing the very real and ongoing struggle against racism around the world, but it's about recognizing that the fight for equality has many fronts, and sometimes the most important battles are those fought within.
Precisely. It's about recognizing the universality of prejudice.
Yeah.
Right? And understanding that we all have a role to play in dismantling these systems of oppression, no matter where we find them.
Well, this deep dive has really given us a lot to think about. We've gone from the tragic death of George Floyd and the global outcry against racism to the complex history and lasting legacy of tribalism in Africa. And we've explored how these seemingly disparate events are interconnected, forcing us to confront, I think, some uncomfortable truths about prejudice and the ongoing struggle for equality.
It's a conversation that challenges those conventional narratives, right? And it encourages us to examine our own biases and assumptions, because ultimately, the fight against injustice requires us to look inward as much as we look outward, to acknowledge our own complicity in these systems, and to work actively to dismantle them.
It's a call to action for all of us, no matter where we come from or what our background is. So to our listeners, how does this new perspective on tribalism and its impact on Africa reshape your understanding of the fight for equality, both within Africa and around the world? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so keep the conversation going and let us know. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.